Part 3, our hidden healing energy. Disease is not an entity, but a fluctuating condition of the patient's body, a battle between the substance of disease and the natural healing tendency of the body. Hippocrates. Chapter 8, the Silver Wand. When Apollo whisked Aeneas off the field of battle before Troy, he healed the hero's shattered thigh bone in a matter of minutes. Without a god at the bedside, the process takes 3 to 6 months, and sometimes it fails. If the bones didn't knit, the limb formally had to be amputated after the victim had suffered for a year or more. It was only in 1972 that I felt ready to try electrical stimulation of human bone growth in such cases. Zachary B. Burr Friedenberg, Carl Brighton, and their research group at the University of Pennsylvania had already reported the first successful electrical healing of a non-union 2 years before. But to avoid possible side effects, we felt we must duplicate the natural signal more closely than they had. And we didn't know enough until after our work on the rat leg regeneration. Like Friedenberg, we decided to place a negative electrode between the bone pieces, but using a much smaller current and a silver electrode rather than the stainless steel. We thought silver would be less likely to react chemically with the tissue and better able to transmit the electrical current. At that time, we were treating a patient whose condition seemed to demand that we try the new procedure. Minus for growth, plus for infection. Jim was in bad shape. Drafted during the Vietnam War, he'd been a reluctant, rebellious soldier. He survived his tour in Nam and was transferred to an army base in Kansas in late 1970. On New Year's Eve, he broke both legs in an auto crash. The local hospital put him in traction with pins drilled through the skin and bones to hold pieces together. When he was moved to the base hospital a few days later, all the pins had to be removed due to infection. Jim's doctors couldn't operate because of the bacteria, so they had to be satisfied with a cast. Because he'd broken one leg below and the other above the knee, he needed a huge cast called a double hip spica. He was totally encased in the plaster, from his feet to the middle of his chest for 6 months. By August, his left lower leg had healed, but the right femur showed no progress at all. The 1/4-inch holes where the pins had been were still draining pus, preventing surgery. That September, he was given a medical discharge and flown to the Syracuse VA hospital. When I first saw him, he was still in a large cast, although now his left leg was free. The halves of the right thigh bone were completely loose. There was nothing in standard practice to do but leave the cast on and hope. After 6 more months, Jim's hope was just about gone. For a year, he'd lain in bed, unable to leave the hospital for even a brief visit home. He vented his rage against the staff, then grew despondent and unable to face the future, which no longer seemed to include his right leg. Then Sarah Bonko, a young orthopedic surgeon in the last year of residency, was assigned to my service from the medical school. He'd already been a good doctor when he briefly worked with me 2 years before. Sal Barranco, smart, hardworking, and really interested in his patients. He took over Jim's care, spent many hours talking with him, and arranged for counseling. Nothing seemed to help. Jim slipped further and further away from us. Sal had always been interested in what was going on in the lab. In fact, I'd often tried to interest him in a career of teaching and research, but he preferred surgery and its rewards of helping people directly. In February of 1972, as we were nearing the clinical stage with our bone stimulator, Sal said, "You know, Dr. Becker, you really should consider electrically stimulating Jim's fracture. I don't see anything else left. It's his last chance. The problem was that none of Friedenberg's patients had been infected. Although Jim's septic pen tracks weren't right at the fracture, they were too close for comfort. If I stirred up those bacteria when I operated to insert the electrodes, the game was lost. Moreover, it was obvious by now that electricity was the most important growth stimulus to cells. Even if it produced healing, no one could be sure what these cells would do in the future. They might become hypersensitive to other stimuli and start growing malignantly later. This was the first time in the history of medicine that we could start at least one type of growth at will. I was afraid of beginning a clinical program that might seize the public's fancy and be applied on a large scale before we knew enough about the technique. If disastrous side effects showed up later, we could lose momentum toward a revolutionary advance in medicine. I decided that if I carefully explained what we proposed to do, with all its uncertainties, and let the patient choose, then ethically I'd be doing the right thing. As to the infection, for several years we had been looking for a way to stop growth. My experiments with Bassett on dogs back in 1964 suggested that just as we could turn growth on with negative electricity, so could we turn it off with positive current? If true, this obviously could be a great importance in cancer treatment, because ours was always a needy program, trying to do more than we had for grants. We couldn't afford the expensive equipment needed to test the idea of cancer cells. We had to settle for bacteria. In preliminary tests, we found that silver electrodes, when made electrically positive, would kill all types of bacteria in a zone about half an inch in diameter. Apparently, because of the positive silver ions driven into the culture by the applied voltage. This was an exciting discovery because no single antibiotic worked against all types of bacteria. I thought that if I inserted the silver wire into Jim's non-union and the area became infected, I could, as a last resort, make the electrode positive, perhaps save the leg a while longer. Of course, the positive current could well delay healing further, actually destroy more bone. I explained all this to Jim and said that if he wished, I would do it. I wanted him to know the procedure was untested and potentially dangerous. With tears in his eyes, he begged, "Please try, Dr. Becker. I want my leg." 2 days later, Sal and I operated through a hole in the cast. The fracture was completely loose, with not one sign of healing. We removed a little scar tissue from the bone and implanted the electrode. The part in between the bone ends was bare wire, the rest running through the muscles and out of the skin. It was insulated so as to deliver the minuscule negative current only to the bone. The infection didn't spread, and Jim's spirits improved. As I made my daily rounds 3 weeks later, he said, "I'm sure it's healing. I just know it." I was still nervous when, 6 weeks after surgery, it was time to pull out the electrode, remove the cast, and get an x-ray. I needn't have worried. Not only did the x-ray show a sort of new bone, but when I examined the leg myself, I could no longer move the fracture. We put Jim in a walking cast, and he left the hospital for the first time in 16 months. In another 6 weeks, the fracture had healed enough for us to remove the cast. And Jim started rehabilitation for his knee, which had stiffened from disuse. All the pen tracks, especially the ones nearest the break, were still draining, and Jim asked, "Why not use the silver wire on this hole to kill the infection? Then I'll be all done and won't have to worry anymore about infecting the rest of the bone." I had to agree with this logic. If the hole through the muscle to the outside healed shut, the infection would be more likely to spread within the bone. However, I told him that the positive current might prevent the hole from filling in with bone, making a permanent weak spot there. We put in the electrode and used the same current as before, except reversing its polarity. I had no idea how long to let it run, so I arbitrarily pulled it out after 1 week. Nothing much seemed to have happened. The drainage might have been a little less, though not much. But I was afraid to use the positive current anymore for fear of further weakening the bone. Jim left the hospital and didn't keep his next appointment in the clinic. A year later, he returned unannounced, saying he was just traveling through Syracuse and thought I would like to see how he was doing. He was walking normally with no pain, placing full weight on the right leg. He said the drainage had stopped a week after he left the hospital and had never recurred. X-rays showed the fracture solidly healed and the one pin track I'd treated filling in with new bone. The pin side on the other leg was still infected, and I said we could treat that in a few days, since we'd improve our technique in the meantime. No, I have to be moving on, Jim replied. I don't have a job. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know I don't want to spend any more time in hospitals. Sal had been graduated from the residency program a few months after Jim was discharged in 1973. But before he left, he spent all his free time in the lab helping us test bacteria killing electrodes. A few previous reports had mentioned inconsistent antibacterial effects, some with alternating current, some with negative DC using stainless steel. But there hadn't been no systematic study of the subject. We tried silver, platinum, gold, stainless steel, and copper electrodes, using a wide range of currents on four disparate kinds of bacteria, including Staphylococcus aureus, one of the most common and most troublesome. Soon we were able to explain the earlier inconsistencies. All 5 metals stopped growth of all bacteria at both poles, as long as we used high currents. Unfortunately, high currents also produce toxic effects, chemical changes in the medium, gas formation, and corrosion, with all but silver electrodes. Apparently, such currents through most metals worked by poisoning both bacteria and nearby tissues. Our preliminary observations turned out to be right. Silver at the positive pole killed or deactivated every type of bacteria without side effects, even with very low currents. We also tried the silver wires on bacteria grown in cultures of mouse connective tissue and bone marrow. And the ions wiped out the bacteria without affecting the living mouse cells. We were certain it was silver ions that did the job, rather than the current. When we found the silver impregnated culture medium killed new bacteria placed in it after the current was switched off. The only other metal that had any effect was gold. It worked against Staphylococcus, but not nearly as well as silver. Of course, the germ-killing action of silver had been known for some time. At the turn of the century, silver foil was considered the best infection-preventing dressing for wounds. Writing in 1973, the eminent surgeon William Stewart Halstead referred to the centuries-old practice of putting silver wire in wounds, then said of the foil, I know of nothing which could quite take its place, nor have I known any one to abandon it who had thoroughly familiarized himself with the technique of its employment. With the advent of better infection-fighting drugs, silver fell out of favor because its ions bind avidly to proteins and thus don't penetrate tissue beyond the very surface. A few silver compounds still have specialized use in some eye, nose, and throat infections, and the Soviets used silver ions to sterilize recycled water aboard their space stations. But the most part, medicine has abandoned the metal. Electrified silver offers several advantages over previous forms, however. There are no other ions besides silver to burden the tissue. The current injects or drives the silver ions further than simple fusion can. Moreover, it's especially well suited for use against several kinds of bacteria simultaneously. It kills even antibiotic-resistant strains and also works on fungus infections. For treating wounds, however, there was one big problem with the technique. Its effect was still too local, extending only about a quarter inch from the wire. For large areas, we needed something like a piece of window screen made of silver. But this would have been expensive and also too stiff to mold into the contours of a wound. We'd been doing our clinical experiments with financial support from a multinational medical equipment company that made our black boxes, the battery packs with all their circuitry that powered our electrodes. I discussed the problem with the company's young research director, Jack Turby, and a few weeks later he came back with a fascinating material. NASA needed an electrically conductive fabric, and a small manufacturing company had produced nylon parachute cloth coated with silver. It could be cut to any size and was eminently flexible. It performed beautifully, although the silver ion still didn't get more than a quarter of an inch from it. We could use it to cover a large area. Hopeful that we might have a cure for two of an orthopedist's worst nightmares, non-union and osteomyelitis, bone infection. We studied the positive silver technique in the lab and continued to use the negative electrodes to stimulate bone growth in selected patients. Word spread via newspaper and TV reports. He began getting patients from all over the nation. But we didn't accept many for the experimental program due to my conservative viewpoint. I applied the same criteria on it as before. Electrical treatment had to be the patient's last chance. While slowly gaining experience, we surveyed the literature to stay informed about other people's work. As of 1976, 14 research groups had used bone stimulators on some 700 patients for spinal fusion and fresh fractures, as well as non-unions, all with the seemingly good results. We used our electrical generator on only 13 patients by then. We were the only ones using silver electrodes, a lucky choice as it turned out. All the others were using stainless steel, platinum, or titanium. We used 100 to 200 nanoamps per centimeter of electrode, while Brighton and most other investigators were using 10,000 to 20,000 nanoamps. The low level approximated the natural current and also minimized the chances of a dangerous side effect. Brighton and Friedenberg had found a danger of infection and tissue irritation when running their high current electrodes at more than 1 volt. We figured this couldn't happen at our amperage. But just to be sure, we built in an alarm circuit to shut off our box automatically if the electrical force rose close to 1 volt. By this time, we'd also cleared up several more cases of osteomyelitis by reversing the battery and making the silver electrode positive for a day. It looked safe. There was no crossover of effects. When negative, the wire didn't make infectious bacteria grow, and when positive, it didn't destroy bone-forming cells or prevent them from growing when we stitched the current to negative. Our confidence in this method grew with one of our most challenging cases, which also forced us to revise our theories. In December of 1976, a young man was sent to our clinic for a possible amputation. John was a man of the Northwoods. Weathered and hard, he faced the problems of philosophically. What got to be has got to be, he said through tight lips. 3 years before, he'd been in a snowmobile accident, breaking his right tibia, shin bone, in 3 places, and also fracturing the fibula, the smaller bone of the lower leg. He'd been treated at a small local hospital, where the broken bones had become infected. He'd undergone several operations to remove dead bone and treat the infection, but the bacteria continued to spread. He came to us with the fracture still not healed and with a long cavity on the front of the shin in which he could see right into the dead and infected bone. He was struggling to walk in a cast extending up to his hip. He was married with 5 young children, and his leg was obviously not the only place he was having trouble making ends meet. What kind of work do you do? I asked him. I trap muskrats, Doc. That's all. That's all, Doc. And how do you manage with that cast on? I put a rubber hip boot on over the cast, Doc. Muskrat trapping is hard work, a tough way to make a living, even for a man with two good legs. John, if you have an amputation and wear an artificial leg, you sure won't be able to do that. What will you do then? I don't know. Welfare, probably. Probably go nuts. You really like to work in the woods, don't you? Wouldn't do anything else, Doc. Well, let's get you admitted to the hospital. Something has to be done, and I have an idea that might let you keep your leg. For the first time, John smiled. In fighting the infection, the first step was to identify the enemy, the microbes. John's wound was a veritable zoo. There were at least 5 different types of bacteria living in it. Even with only one kind, osteomyelitis is notoriously hard to treat. Very little blood reaches the bone cells, so both antibiotics and the body's own defense agents are hampered in getting where they're needed. And even if we could get it to the bone, no single antibiotic could fight all of John's germs. Even a mixture would probably create a greater problem than it solved. For any bacteria resistant to the mix would spread like wildfire when the others competed against them were killed. John's x-rays were chaotic as bacteria cultures, pieces of dead bone all over the place with absolutely no healing. But we had to deal with the infection first. Since we'd have to use positive current for quite a while, I was afraid we'd destroy some of the bone, but I told John that 6 months after we got the wound to heal over the skin, I would bring him back into the hospital and use the negative current to stimulate whatever was left. I couldn't promise anything, and since I hadn't yet tried the silver nylon on this type of wound, we might run into unexpected problems. But John agreed with me that he had nothing to lose except his leg, which would certainly have to come off if we didn't try my plan. A few days later, I debrided the wound, removing the dead tissue and all grossly infected or dead bone. There wasn't much left afterward. It was an enormous excavation running almost from his knee to his ankle. In the operating room, we soaked a big piece of silver nylon in saline solution and laid it over the wound. It had been cut with a tail, serving as the electrical contact and also as sort of pull tab that we could keep dry outside the cavity. We packed the fabric in place with saline-soaked gauze, wrapped the leg, and connected the battery unit. I watched John anxiously during the first 2 days. If trouble was going to occur, that was when I expected it. By the third day, he was eating well, and the current was beginning to drop off, indicating more resistance at the surface of the wound. Now it was time to change the dressing. We were overjoyed to see what the silver hadn't corroded, and the wound looked great. Carefully, took a bacterial culture and applied a new silver nylon dressing. The next morning, Sharon Chapin, an exceptional lab technician who took an active part in some of the research, showed me the bacterial cultures. The number of bacteria had dropped dramatically. I went to give John the good news and change his dressing again. When I realized that I could teach him to do his own daily dressing changes, they were time consuming for me, but John had too much time on his hands and was the one most interested in doing the best thing for his leg. It was a nice feeling to teach a muskrat trapper who had dropped out of school at 16 how to do an experimental medical procedure. He learned fast, and in a day or so, he was changing dressings himself and measuring the current too. By the end of the week, he allowed as how he did a better job than I did. Maybe he did at that, because by then all of our bacterial cultures were sterile. All 5 kinds had been killed. The soft healing tissue, called granulation tissue, was spreading out and covering the bone. In 2 weeks, the whole base of the wound, which had been over 8 square inches of raw bone, was covered with this friendly pink carpet. The skin was beginning to grow in, too, so we could forget about the grafts we thought we'd need to do. I decided to take an x-ray to see how much bone he'd lost. I could hardly believe the picture. There was clearly some bone growth. We'd been working through a hole in the cast, so I had no idea if the fracture was still loose. Without telling John why, I didn't want to get his hopes up if I was wrong. I removed the cast, felt the leg, and found that the pieces were all stuck together. John watched, and when I was done, he lifted his leg into the air triumphantly. It held straight against gravity. His grin opened broader than the 8-lane highway. I thought you said the bone wouldn't heal yet, Doc. I'd never so much enjoyed being wrong, but I warned John not to get too excited until we were sure the good news would hold up. I put him back into a cast and continued treatment another month until the skin healed over. By then, the x-rays showed enough repair to warrant a walking cast. John left the hospital on crutches and promised not to run around in the swamps until I told him it was all right. He didn't come back until 2 months later. The cast was in tatters, and he walked in without crutches, smiling at everyone. The last x-rays confirmed it. Healing was nearly complete, and John went back to the wilds. By mid-1978, we'd successfully treated 14 osteomyelitis patients with the positive silver mesh wire. The funny thing was, in 5 of them, we'd healed non-unions as a side effect, without any negative current at all. Obviously, it was time to revise our idea that negative electricity alone fostered growth and positive inhibited it. Andy Marino, John Spadaro, and I talked it over. Reducing the DC stimulation technique is so essential to it as essentials. All you needed was an electrode that wouldn't react with the tissue fluid when it wasn't passing current. Since a negative electrode didn't give off ions, any inert metal, such as stainless steel, platinum, or titanium, would work with that polarity. But we knew from our lab work that the situation was very different at the positive pole, where the current drove charged atoms of the metal into the nearby environment. We decided it must be a chemical, not electrical process that were preventing the bacterial growth at the positive electrode. In that case, maybe polarity was unimportant in growth enhancement. We postulated that because silver ions were non-toxic to human cells and the electrical aspect was right, we inadvertently grew bone with positive current. This idea turned out to be quite wrong, but we'll get to that story in due time. Joe, who was always fascinated by the history of science, now found that none of the contemporary research groups had been the first to stimulate bone repair electrically. We'd all been beaten by more than 150 years. Back in 1812, Dr. John Birch of St. Thomas Hospital in London used electrical shocks to heal a non-union of the tibia. A Dr. Hall of New York, Pennsylvania, later used direct current through electroacupuncture needles for the same purpose. And by 1860, Dr. Arthur Garrett of Boston stated that his electrotherapy textbook that in a few times he'd needed to try it, this method had never failed. Because of the primitive state of electrical science then, we didn't know how much current these doctors had used. However, the polarity didn't seem to matter, and they used gold electrodes, which were nearly as non-toxic as positive poles as silver. Realizing that we didn't show as much as we'd thought about the growth control lock, we continued to apply the silver key. At least 70 patients with bone infections have now had the silver nylon treatment, including 20 at Louisiana State University Medical School in Shreveport, where Andy Marino ended up after the closing of our lab in 1980. In some of our first cases, we noticed a discharge exuding from the tissues and sticking to the mesh when we changed the dressings. We thought it was reactive, exuded, from irritation by the current until one day when, during a slight delay in the operating room, I sent a sample of it into the pathology lab. It was filled with such a variety of cells that we had to rule out a simple response to irritation. Instead, there was a variety of primitive looking cell types looking just like the active bone marrow of children. However, the patients were long past that age, and besides, their marrow cavities were closed off with scar tissue from their unmended and infected bone injuries. We had to consider another source. The exudate appeared at the same time as the granulated silver tissue, which composed mainly of fibroblasts, ubiquitous connective cells, forming a major part of most soft tissues. Since the exudate also contained some fibroblasts, we decided to see if the unfamiliar types had arisen by metamorphosis from them. We set up a series of 3-compartment culture dishes and placed a standard colony of isolate, purebred mouse fibroblasts in each. In one section, we put in a positive silver electrode, in one, a negative electrode, and in the third, a piece of silver wire not connected to anything. In cells right next to all 3 wires, the cytoplasm changed to an abnormal texture in response to ions of dissolved silver, which migrated only about 1/100th of a millimeter. There was no other effects in the control or negative current chambers. Around the positive poles, however, this region was succeeded by an area of great activity for a distance of 5 millimeters on all sides. While doing their job of holding things together, fibroblasts have a characteristic spiky shape, with long sticky branches extending in all directions. In this region, where silver ions had been driven by the current, many of the cells had changed into a static, globular form in which mitosis didn't occur. These seemed to be in a suspended animation, floating freely instead of adhering to other cells or the sides of the dishes as usual. Mixed among them were many featureless cells with enlarged nuclei and end products of dedifferentiation. More and more of the rounded fibroblasts turned into fully despecialized cells as the test progressed. Beyond the 5 millimeter line was a border zone with partial changes, followed by a realm of normal spiky fibroblasts. Dedifferentiated cells normally divide rapidly, but these didn't, perhaps because they were sitting in a plastic dish far removed from the normal stimuli of an animal's body. Within a day after the current was turned off, the cells clumped together into bits of pseudotissue that looked like the young bone marrow we'd seen in the exudate. After 2 weeks, they'd all reverted back to mature fibroblasts, presumably because the regular replacement of the nutrient medium had by then washed out all the silver ions. To learn more about these astonishing changes, we studied pieces of granulation tissue itself, taken from the patients treated with the silver nylon. We placed the samples in culture dishes and observed them as they grew. Without the silver factor, we would have expected a population of slowly proliferating fibroblasts. However, these cells grew fast, producing a diverse and surprising assortment of primitive forms, including fully dedifferentiated cells, rounded fibroblasts, and amoeba-like cells. Strangest of all were giant cells that looked almost like fertilized eggs, very active and with several nuclei. The nucleolus is a little nucleus within the nucleus proper. When other cells encountered the giant cells, the smaller cells often split open and emitted their nuclei into the giants. After 2 weeks, these diverse cells had coalesced into an amorphous mass of primitive cells closely resembling a blastema. And in another week, as silver washed out, they'd all become stayed sober fibroblasts, is acting as though nothing had happened. The major difference between two experiments was that the second one started with the cells that had already been exposed to positive silver ions in the human body. Their rapid growth had an unspecialized forms, suggested that the fibroblasts in the first experiment had in fact been dedifferentiated. It remains to be seen exactly what the various forms do, but it's obvious that the aggregate they found profoundly stimulates soft tissue healing in a way that's unlike any known natural process. We ran a controlled study of healing enhancement on pigs, their skin being physiologically closest to that of humans. Positive silver nylon accelerated the healing of measured skin wounds on the animals' backs by over 50% as compared with identical control wounds made on the backs of the same animals at the same time. We saw positive silver's life-saving potential most clearly in our experience with a patient named Tom in 1979. Tom had a massive doses of X-ray for cancer of the larynx, and his larynx later had to be removed because of the radiation. The surrounding tissue was helpless against infection, and the skin and the muscle of his entire neck literally dissolved into a horrid wound. The ear, nose, and throat doctor treating him begged me to try the nylon, and I agreed after attending physician got a release signed by the head of his department. After 1 month of electrified silver treatment, the infection was gone and healing was progressing. The wound healed completely in a total of 3 months, although Tom soon died from tumors elsewhere in his body. I reported this case at a small National Institute of Health meeting the same year. One physician who said he'd never heard of any comparable healing of such a grave wound was moved to exclaim after seeing my slides, "I have witnessed a miracle." We may have only scratched the surface of positive silver's medical brilliance. Already, it's an amazing tool. It stimulates bone-forming cells, cures the most stubborn infections, and all kinds of bacteria, and stimulates healing in skin and other soft tissues. We don't know whether the treatment can induce healing in other parts of the body, but the possibility is there. And there may be other marvels latent in his magic caduceus. Just before our research group was disbanded, we studied malignant fibrosarcoma cells and found that electrically charged infected silver suspended their runway mitosis. Most important of all, the technique makes it possible to produce large numbers of dedifferentiated cells, overcoming the main problem of mammalian regeneration, the limited number of bone marrow cells that dedifferentiated in response to electrical current alone. Whatever its precise mode of action may be, the electrically generated silver ion can produce enough cells for human blastemas. It has restored my belief that full regeneration of limbs and perhaps other body parts can be accomplished in humans. Many questions remain, however. We don't know how the changed cells speed up healing or how the silver changes them. We don't know how electrically produced silver ions differ from ordinary dissolved ions, how only that they do. They evoke widely different reactions from the fibroblast, and the cells affected by dissolved ions close to the electrode are prevented from dedifferentiating in response to the electrified silver. Most important is a search for possible delayed side effects. These questions urgently need research by some good electrochemist, but the work isn't being done. We were probably lucky we hadn't found this effect in our first round of lab tests on silver electrodes. The Food and Drug Administration let us test the antibacterial technique on selected patients because we found no toxicity and because a few hours a day was enough. To say that the same electrodes run for a longer time could stimulate healing was such a bold claim that permission probably would have been denied. At this point, however, we sorely need enough imagination on the part of research sponsors to follow up with these leads in the laboratories while making the treatment available now to the desperate few who have no other hope. A fracture market. Where does all this leave us in our understanding of electrically triggered bone healing? I'm afraid we're not too much better off than the 19th century doctors who lost this effective treatment because no one understood it well enough to defend it from electrotherapy's opponents. Of course, we have more pieces of the puzzle today, but we still don't have a complete picture of how any of the competing techniques work. Besides our low current silver electrodes, there are two other basic types of bone growth stimulators. Friedenberg and Brighton at first placed their stiff stainless steel wires through the holes drilled into the bone near the break. Now, a semi-invasive refinement is used in many patients, sticking the electrodes through the flesh into the fracture gap under the local anesthetic. Several may be needed for a large bone. They're connected to a self-contained battery pack set right into the cast. Friedenberg and Brighton patented their invention, and it's now approved for the FDA and marketed. About three-fourths of the groups treating patients use some variation on this theme. Australian researchers under D.C. Patterson devised a spiral titanium electrode that's placed into a notch cut in the bone on the sides of the fracture. It's now also FDA approved and marketed. Since this device, battery pack and all, must be implanted and removed in two separate operations, and since the electrode usually must be left behind in the bone, late complications may occur. Others have taken a completely different approach, using pulsed electromagnetic fields, or PEMF, to induce currents in the fracture area from outside the body. The best known proponents of this method, Andrew Bassett and electrochemist Arthur Pilla, worked together at the Orthopedic Research Laboratories of Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York until 1982. Pilla is now at Mount Sinai Medical Center. They developed a pair of electromagnetic coils sheathed in plastic pads connected to a book-sized generator that plugs into a wall socket. Having experimented with a wide variety of pulsed fields, Bassett and Pilla found that four that stimulate fracture healing. The one that works best, which is now also approved and available commercially, is produced by electromagnets, driven by alternating current supplied in bursts of pulses. Although it ties the patient to an electrical outlet for 12 hours a day, mostly during sleep, of course, this apparatus completely avoids surgery and its attendant's risk. The funny thing is that all three methods, low current, high current, and PEMF, seem to work equally as well. Since the FDA approved them late in 1979, success rates have stabilized at about 80%. As far as two electrode methods are concerned, I believe some experiments we did in 1977 and 1978 revealed why they both work. When we arranged all the reports in order from lowest current to highest, we found a narrow band of low amperages and a wide band of higher ones that worked, separate by a range in between that failed. We tested various non-silver electrodes on animals and found that at the effective currents, they all produced some electrochemical changes, even at the negative pole. Among other products, they created various highly reactive ions called free radicals, essential in cellular chemistry, but also destructive in excess. These radicals irritate cells, and since any continuous irritation stimulates bone-forming cells to lay down new matrix in self-defense, we concluded that the higher current methods worked primarily by such irritation. Conversely, I believe low current silver electrodes stimulate bone formation directly by dedifferentiation the marrow cells and perhaps also by stimulating the periosteal cells. At first, PEMP research suggests that the coils worked by inducing in the tissues electrical currents that changed the permeability of cell membranes to calcium. In most non-unions, at least a small amount of fracture callus has appeared, consisting of collagen fibers, but for some reason, it hasn't entered in the next stage, in which apatite crystals form on the fibers. Work by Pilla and Bassett suggested that the currents induced by the pulsed fields cause the cells of the callus to absorb large amounts of calcium. Later, when the coils were turned off, They reasoned the cells dumped this calcium outside among the collagen fibers, and apatite crystals finally formed where they belonged. Their experiments raised the hope that other waveforms might regulate membrane passages of other ions or even control DNA transcription. And protein synthesis. It seemed these field-induced currents might act as vocal cords, allowing us to speak to the cell's nucleus via membranes, such as sound waves communicate with the brain via the ear. PEMP does in fact induce currents of a type never found normally in the body. Each pulse produces millions of tiny eddy currents, briefly flowing in circles. As the magnetic field expands at the beginning of a pulse, the currents circle in one direction. As it collapses, they reverse. However, the latest research has cast doubt on the idea that these currents affect specific cellular processes. Rather, it seems that artificial time-varying magnetic fields directly activate the cells by speeding up their mitotic rate, as discussed in more detail in Chapter 15. You may ask, as long as something works, why quibble about how? My answer is that understanding how is our best hope for using the tool right, without causing our patients other problems later. By sticking our own neologisms into the cell's delicate grammar, we automatically risk garbling it in unforeseen ways. As of now, we're like blind people crossing a minefield. Accelerated mitosis is a hallmark of malignancy as well as healing, and long-term exposure to time-varying electromagnetic fields has been linked to increased rates of cancer in humans. Bassett has discounted potential dangers, saying, "You would experience almost the same field strength by standing under a fluorescent light. However, a fluorescent lamp may well feel like a floodlight to cells that can see nanoamperes of current." One of the main lessons of bioelectromagnetism so far is that less is often more. On the other hand, it's too easy to assume that natural is better. Since it would vindicate our low current method, I obviously hope it's true, but the fact remains that putting electrodes in a bone itself a very unnatural act. Stimulation of healing outside the normal limits of process may incur fewer risks in the end. So far, the evidence suggests otherwise, but we don't yet know for sure. That's why I keep emphasizing the need to go slowly. Use these contraptions only when all else has failed until we understand them better. The most urgent need is a search for possible malignant effects. As far as I know, I've done the only such research on electrodes to date. One simple tissue culture study without grant support, using some money I saved from our last research project funded by the manufacturer of the battery pack. I proposed more extensive tests to various granting agencies before our lab was closed, but was turned down every time. I exposed standard cultures of human fibrosarcoma cells to 360 nanoamps from stainless steel electrodes. I tried it 5 times, and each time there was a threefold increase in cell population at both electrodes, even for cancer cells. This is remarkable proliferation for such a short time. To my knowledge, none of the developers or marketers of electrode devices have chosen to duplicate this test or try their own, despite the ease of doing the work and the fact that they have plenty of money. Whatever evidence on this point that may have been presented to the FDA hasn't been made public. After the evaluation panel granted commercial approval, however, several of its members expressed fears that this possibility hadn't been adequately tested. At this time, therefore, I must conclude that high current electrodes might enhance the growth of pre-existing tumor cells in the electrical path, unlike low current silver, which when negative had no effect on, and when positive suspended mitosis of cancer, mitosis of cancer cells in our lab. As for Pimp, Bassett and Pilla believed that only cells in a healing process gone awry can hear the waveform, so they discount the idea of cancer enhancement from it. They claim to have found no PIMPs that produce or accelerate malignant growth. On the contrary, Pilla and oncologist Larry Norton of Mount Sinai say they found at least one that seemed to inhibit it in lab animals. They claim in seriously flawed, however. This claim is seriously flawed, however, because of the difference between subjecting an entire animal to a magnetic field and directing the same field to a small area around fracture. See Chapter 4. Moreover, in 1983, Kamine, a Japanese orthopedic researcher, reported that the pulsed magnetic field used for bone healing dramatically increased the mitotic rate of cancer cells. The same fields inhibited the return of such stimulated cancer cells to a more normal state. Thus, PEMF, like high current treatments, apparently does enhance cancer growth. In the last decade or so, electrobiologists have learned a great deal about the effects of time-varying electromagnetic fields, as opposed to steady-state fields, on living tissue. We'll review these discoveries in Chapter 14 and 15. The evidence to date indicates that PEMF works by increasing the mitotic rate of the healing cells, not by altering calcium metabolism. If so, it can't possibly discriminate between bone healing cells and any other type. It will accelerate the growth of any cellular system that is actively growing. This includes not only healing tissues, but fetal and malignant tissues as well. At the present rate of basic research, we won't have direct proof on whether electrical healing stimulators are nurturing seeds of cancer in humans until 2 or 3 decades from now. We could find out much sooner by simple experiments on animals having shorter lifespans. Until we have that definitive answer, I contend that all 3 techniques should remain available as a last result to prevent loss of limb. But I'm appalled at their increasing use to speed up orthodontics to accelerate healing of fresh fractures. Unfortunately, the trend is away from caution. By the same time this book is published, tens of thousands of patients will have been treated with these devices, many as a first rather than the last resort. At a recent orthopedic meeting, I learned that 4 more companies are hoping to market new models. Several have asked me to advise them, but I haven't found one yet that wants to embark on any serious research. Without such a commitment, I refuse to take part in any battle of a salesman. I never even tried to patent the low current silver method because a medical device generally isn't considered patentable if the research that went into it was conducted throughout the scientific community and published for all to read. As I see it, the rush to the marketplace can only spawn jurisdictional disputes and ensure that important findings are kept as proprietary secrets. Electrical osteogenesis could be the opening wedge into a new era of medicine. Within a few years, we may know how to use these techniques to repair joint cartilage or even replace whole joints and to correct various defects of bone growth. In the further future, we may be able to extend regeneration as needed to nearly all human tissues. For the time, a physician can now direct nature, albeit in a small way, rather than play her helpless servant. We must use this power wisely. We're tapping into the most potent force in all of biology. If we're irresponsible about it, we risk another electrical letdown that could put off medicine's glorious future for many years. And we're stopping on page 180.